If I could have your attention, we will begin our program. Thanks again for being with us. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker, Scott Dillard, who is a graduate of West Point, served his military service in a combination of places, including Fort Riley, Fort Benning, Iraq, and Afghanistan as a platoon leader and as a company commander. Following his military service, he became involved with Fluor Corporation and was a contractor overseas, and you'll hear about that in this talk. And then now has his own company that he's formed with others, and he'll tell you about that. I want to also thank him for, on very short notice, as I told you about the cancellation we had, filling in for us. So give him applause for being here and for being at the very last minute putting something together for us. Thank you very much. Come on up, Scott.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Bob, and certainly thank you everyone for coming here today on again relatively short notice. Kind of as Bob you mentioned earlier, several months ago, connected with General Martin and on LinkedIn. And he was like, "Hey, do you know somewhere I could speak to promote my book and raise awareness and those sorts of things?" And I'm like, "Sure, I know Bob and military lecture series here." So as Bob alluded last week, he had a family emergency come up. So here I am, and hopefully I don't disappoint. And like I also told Bob, I said, fortunately the timing is kind of right. If this had been a month or 2 months ago, I might not have really had anything too interesting to talk about other than ever-growing fish stories from Iraq and Afghanistan. But now I think I do, in terms of a new nonprofit that we started, the Association of Zone Contractors, and looking to serve the contractor community writ large. So what I want to talk about here today is something that I think few people know about, and that is really the role of private military contractors in the United States, really going all the way back to the colonial period. And the use of contractors, like I said, kind of predates the formation of the U.S., and it even helped bring us our first Thanksgiving, and it ensured the survival of Jamestown. As Michael Waller notes, quote, "Private colonial companies invested private money to pay private soldiers to raise private armies for the English colonization of New England, Virginia, and much of the rest is what is now the eastern United States. For example, Jamestown survived thanks to the Virginia Company's Captain John Smith, later a colonial governor, and in Massachusetts, the Plymouth Company hired a professional soldier, Miles Standish, to join them on the Mayflower and provide security for the Pilgrims. Once settled, Standish became military commander for what is, in essence, a private colony, and his influence is still seen today on the Massachusetts state seal, which bears the image of the arm of a private contractor brandishing a sword. Who knew? In fact, the history of the U.S. draws a straight line to these early contractors, as the Cato Institute's David Eisenberg notes that, quote, "The private militia of the Massachusetts Bay Company in 1636 is the ancestor of the Massachusetts Minutemen, who became the first units of the U.S. Army in 1775. Eisenberg further notes that, quote, "Privately capitalized companies ran the early American colonies and usually financed their self-defense forces on their own, though legal authority still came from the British government. Essentially, the Crown outsourced the defense of the colonies to the colonists themselves. British troops wouldn't become heavily involved until the French and Indian Wars in the mid-1750s. So I guess you could say, to put it mildly, the use of private military contractors is really nothing new. And in the beginning, these companies performed the functions of the state under the authority from the king." Kind of moving on from the colonial era, you get into the Revolutionary War. And the dynamic didn't really change with the American Revolution. Contractors were still heavily embedded and involved and played a large part in fighting the British. As Eisenberg further noted, before the start of the revolution, it was a private businessman who offered to build a 1,000-man army at his own expense if the Continental Congress, of which he was a member, failed to fund a standing military. That entrepreneur was George Washington, who himself invested in at least one wartime privateer. So who knew that George Washington was a military contractor? In Patriot Pirates, Robert Patton, the grandson of General George Patton, details how more than 2,000 privately owned warships, or privateers, were commissioned by Congress to attack the enemy and seize transports and sell their cargoes for money during the American Revolution. For comparison, during the 6 years of the American Revolution, the Continental Navy consisted of only 64 ships. The Navy had an arsenal of over 1,200 guns aboard its boats and ships. The privateers had nearly 15,000. The Continental Navy captured 196 enemy ships, compared to the privateers' 2,283. These privateers' actions were so vital to the creation of the United States that they get a shout out in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which states in part that, quote, "The Congress shall have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Letters of marque allow governments to fight their wars using private captains and sailors in lieu of their own navy." During the early days of our country, private contractors continued to serve the United States, both in our first foreign war against the Barbary pirates and again against the British in the War of 1812. Certainly, all West Pointers certainly recognize the name of Alfred Thayer Mahan, of the Thayer Method and Mahan Hall fame, who stated that the nation's fleet of private warships, quote, "cooperated powerfully with other motives to dispose the enemy to liberal terms of peace." Even John Paul Jones, now by far the most famous person buried at the Naval Academy, served as a Russian privateer and admiral after the American Revolution. Kind of moving on into the Civil War, call that the Fat Cat era. So a professor at George Mason University traced the history of private contractors in a study published by the Independent Institute. He found that public navies and armies only began to edge out private contractors in the 19th century as governments became more powerful and better funded. This shift is seen during the Civil War as there appears to be scant information on contractors performing as direct participants in the hostilities, and most of the information seems to be around contract and procurement fraud. Where journalist Robert Tomes noted in the July 1864 publication of Harper's Monthly that, quote, "For sugar, the government often got sand, for coffee, rye, for leather, something no better than brown paper, for sound horses and mules, spavined beasts and dying donkeys, and for serviceable muskets and pistols, the experimental failures of sanguine investors, or the refuse of shops and foreign armories." This corruption led to an increased loss of life and lengthened the Civil War. Because of these issues, Congress passed laws and implemented contracting reforms so that by the Spanish-American War, the system was generally improved than what existed during the Civil War. Moving on to the World Wars and kind of the dawn of what Eisenhower, in 1961 termed the military-industrial congressional complex. During World War I, the U.S. Army hired European workers to reduce logistical demands on Americans. In France, women made up a large portion of the workforce, and the military had to comply with French laws that regulated women's working conditions. The use of locals is a trend that would continue through the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which also had a large local civilian workforce. In fact, the hiring of locals was even considered a weapons system in the Iraq War and Afghanistan through a formal doctrine that was known as Money as a Weapons System Afghanistan, or MAWS-A. Again, I presume there was a similar doctrine in Iraq, but many locals were certainly hired in those wars to support U.S. troops. Kind of circling back to World War I, on the construction side, the U.S. Army Air Service created construction companies, also known as aero construction companies, to build aviation facilities in the UK and airfields in the U.S. By the end of the war, more than 6,000 contractors were working for 39 construction companies. During the interwar period, which included the Great Depression, that was a period of famine for contractors and the military in general. Pre-World War II military budgets were very small. During fiscal years 1922 to 1939, they averaged just $744 million, which was about 1% of GDP. During that period, military procurement followed quite rigid legal procedures, and contracts were automatically awarded to the lowest bidder. By contrast, now contracts are awarded on a best value basis. Also, few businessmen at that time wanted military business, or anything to do really with the New Deal government. In fact, when Fortune magazine surveyed business executives in October 1940, it found that 77% had reservations about doing rearmament work because of their, quote, belief that the present administration in Washington is strongly anti-business, and their consequent discouragement over the predictability of cooperation with this administration on rearmament. However, those conditions would dramatically change, and quickly, beginning in about mid-1940 through late 1941, leading to the birth of what Eisenhower would call 20 years later the military-industrial congressional complex. During that period, Congress appropriated $36 billion just in that period from mid-1940 to late 1941. During that period, Congress appropriated $36 billion for the War Department alone, more than the Army and Navy combined had spent during World War I. With congressional authorization, the War and Navy departments switched from using mainly sealed bid contracts to primarily negotiated contracts, often providing that the contractor be paid his full costs, however much that might be, plus a fixed fee. Contracts could be changed to accommodate changes in the contractor's circumstances or poor management in performing the work. In these and other ways, military contracting became less risky and more rewarding. Thus, when war came in 1941, when war came in 1941, some of the first prisoners of war were over 1,000 civilian contractors taken prisoner by the Japanese when they overran Wake Island. Some of the civilian contractors died defending the island alongside Marines, and nearly 100 were massacred on the atoll after they were captured. The book, Building for War, the epic saga of the civilian contractors and Marines of Wake Island in World War II, tells the story of the race to build naval and air bases on the island at the brink of war with Japan. When Wake Island was attacked, there were 1,145 civilian contractors and 524 military personnel on the island, a 2-to-1 ratio. After captivity, only 895 civilian contractors returned home. Interestingly, in 1981, these civilian prisoners of war were provided veterans benefits, including medical care. The contractors on Wake were employed by Contractors Pacific Naval Air Bases, a consortium of large construction companies that was also involved in military construction on Midway, Johnson and Palmyra atolls, and on Guam. Now, it seems that history is actually repeating itself with the focus on China and bases in the Indo-Pacific. For example, right now, Fluor is rebuilding the runway on Tinian used by the Enola Gay, and I'm sure there are any number of contracts and contractors working in a myriad of places across the Pacific getting ready for what many consider to be the location of the next major power conflict. Kind of moving on here to the Vietnam era. With the sea change that occurred during the lead up to World War II and the creation of the now permanent military-industrial congressional complex, I'm not going to delve too deep into contractors in Vietnam. It was certainly just an extension of what occurred in World War II. However, I will highlight this image, which is striking to me. From my personal experience, just change the clothes and add an identifying company lanyard, and that picture could have just as easily been taken in the 2000s or even today. Moving into what we'll call the modern era. In 1985, the Army established the Logistics Civil Augmentation Program, also known as LOGCAP. LOGCAP is the means through which the Army provides contractor support on the battlefield for base life support services such as cooking and serving food, water purification, changing light bulbs, fixing the toilets, purifying the water, etc. Basically, think of all the services that are needed to run a small city, a base, and LOGCAP can provide those services. Not to be outdone, the other services also have similar programs, though a bit smaller, such as AFCAP. And then, actually, LOGCAP is how I kind of made the transition from, as Bob noted, an infantry officer to becoming a contractor. Back when I was in Iraq in 2003, 2004, I was always on the small little base next to the bigger base that had contractor support. And after I got out, I was in the reserves, and one day I was HHC Company First Sergeant at the Small Arms Readiness Group at Fort Gillem in Georgia. And my first sergeant called me up one day and he said, hey, we've got to provide, the unit had to provide an 03 to 05 branch immaterial officer for LOGCAP support. And I was like, what's LOGCAP? And so I was like, let me look into it and I'll let you know. So I Googled LOGCAP and I'm like, oh, that's the KBR contract that was always on the base near me, but never where I was. So I called him back up and I was like, sure, I'll do it. Yeah, so certainly, as you can see, as I'm standing here today, creating a nonprofit to support war zone contractors, that was certainly what I would call like an inflection point, in my life. If I'd gone a different path, then things would be different in some other way. So, after that, I went to Afghanistan. I was an LSO, a LOGCAP support officer, and then when I came back, as Bob mentioned, I was hired by Fluor. I went to a small contract that was kind of dead and dying when I got there in the Green Zone, supporting the SCID, the Strategic Counterintelligence Directorate, at Camp Union 3 right across from the U.S. Embassy. And then a few months later, I went to Afghanistan, where I'd spend the next 5.5 years with Fluor in Afghanistan. So as you can see here, LOGCAP certainly grew exponentially over the years, and it's now in its 5th iteration. At first, these contracts were relatively small, in line with America's smaller pre-9/11 global contingency footprint, but when 9/11 occurred, these contracts really exploded. So you can see here, the program was started in 1985, first contract in 89, all relatively small. 92 to 96, kind of in Somalia and maybe a little bit in the Balkans. Brown and Root, total contract value was about $815 million. Going into kind of 97 to 2001, 42 million. And then the big one, 2001 to 2011, what's known as LOGCAP 3, KBR had a $38.5 billion no-bid contract for LOGCAP support. In 2008, they divided it up between 3 contractors, KBR, Fluor, and DynCorp, and that contract was worth around $20 billion over the lifetime of that contract. And then now we're on to LOGCAP 5. These dates are actually, it was awarded actually in 2019, and it's scheduled to go through 2030. has a max contract value of $82 billion, of which they spent about $10 billion. They won't spend $82 billion unless there's a major war somewhere, but about halfway through the contract right now, they're at about $10 billion spent against a total max value of $82 billion. And, what's also quite interesting, right, is, and this will come up a little bit later in the discussion as well, but we all heard that, the U.S. military divides the globe up into what they call COCOMs, or combatant commands, where you have CENTCOM, AOR, PACOM, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, EUCOM, et cetera. Well, what few people know is that they also divide the globe up among the contractors for log cap. And so it's a little bit different now, but it's more or less the same concept here, right? So each of these companies, for like KBR has EUCOM, so they have a log cap planner on the EUCOM staff, a couple of log cap planners on the EUCOM staff, so they're totally integrated in to the combatant command force structure for contingency planning. So if something kicks off in EUCOM, KBR is going to be right there with the troops kind of very early on. In Africa, you have AFRICOM. Fluor runs projects today out of their Greenville office in Africa. Okay, here we have joint publication 4-10 operational contract support. This kind of gets to really the embedding of contractors into the current force structure. So in March 2010, the Department of Defense published joint publication 4-10, which states in part, quote, the continual introduction of high-tech equipment coupled with force structure and manning requirements, coupled with force structure and manning reductions, mission-specific force cap restrictions, and high operating tempo means contracted support will augment military forces in most operations. Quote, mission-specific force cap restrictions, end quote, certainly seems to be that we need more people than we're currently allowed, and contractors aren't really counted, so give me a lot of those. It's not an inherently bad thing that the military relies on contractors. However, conversations need to be in the open and not kind of hidden, out of sight, out of mind from the public and lawmakers. So, getting back to what we discussed as well in the pre-colonial, pre-19th century era, warfighting is what is known as an inherently governmental function. But during the post-9/11 global war on terror, contractors often outnumbered military personnel. The numbers of U.S. service members killed and wounded is known down to the individual with, at minimum, specific details as to who, when, and where published. As we should, we honor their sacrifice then, and we honor it still today. They are not forgotten. According to a 2019 congressional report, 6,967 U.S. service members were killed and 52,802 wounded in the global war on terror. Now, this is where it gets far less precise, counting contractors. There are some reports that place the number of contractors killed as exceeding 8,000, while the 2019 congressional report estimates that 3,413 civilian contractors were killed and an additional 38,953 sustained, quote, work-related injuries. While it seems the military casualty totals were greater in total, the numbers can be misleading. In the early days of the conflicts, contractors accounted for only 4% of all fatalities. But by the peak of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in 2009, more contractors were killed annually than military personnel. Enemy fires do not distinguish between military and non-military personnel. so the risks to bodily harm are the same. The only thing that is different is whether or not they are truly counted and their sacrifices known beyond their loved ones and their coworkers. In addition to casualty reports, reports on the number of, quote, boots on ground is similarly underreported. For primarily political reasons, administrations often cap the number of military personnel on the ground, but exclude contractors. This allows commanders to accomplish their mission with fewer troops. As the war in Afghanistan wound down in the CENTCOM area of responsibility, the number of contractors came to greatly outnumber military personnel. In Afghanistan, in 2010 to 2011, the ratio of contractors to military was around 1-to-1. But by the end, it was 3-to-1, with 44,000 contractors to 15,000 military personnel. As we discussed, with the rise of professional armies and stronger nation states, there was a 19th century shift away from contractors' direct participation on the battlefield. However, now, with the rise of a high-tech and highly specialized military, the military is now going back to the future, if you will, and contractors have become a permanent element of the military force structure. The breadth of contractor support on today's battlefield, if fully examined, would likely blow our collective minds. For example, a friend I met at Bagram in 2008, 2009 worked for a private company working directly with special forces, putting together targeting packages for direct action missions as well as drone attacks. And as you can see on this slide, contractors are now providing air refueling support to manned and unmanned aircraft, flying aerial reconnaissance missions, and who knows what else, as the military increasingly relies on the embedded standing army of invisible contractors drawn from the military-industrial congressional complex that Eisenhower warned about in 1961. These contractors are forward deployed today to far-flung places such as Iraq and Africa, with many still under substantial attack. All of this with little reporting. So now I've kind of given a bit of history from the colonial times, Jamestown, Plymouth Company, and all that through kind of where we are today is kind of coming full circle, with contractors being embedded and taking over and doing a lot of the things that previously were kind of more of an inherently governmental function. And in all of this, kind of what gets left out and what's missing and what's not counted are the contractors, the actual people who are doing the job. They're inherently, not being counted here. So over the past, about starting in March, kind of had the idea that, hey, let's try and do something about that. There's a gap here. There's a gaping need. If you just think of it at kind of the big hand, little map level of things, you have a whole host of nonprofits that are doing great work for soldiers and veterans that return from war, but they're missing the 50% of the equation. There are just as many contractors that were overseas experiencing many of the same things that the troops do. So no one's representing them, no one's giving them a voice, no one's ensuring that they're counted. So really over the past, like I said, since March, I've been working to put together the Association of War Zone Contractors. And, kind of started out, called up a friend of mine, Corey, who we worked together, Corey Archibald. She and I worked together in Afghanistan. And just so happens to be that she's kind of been in the nonprofit space over the past 10 years doing a lot of work. And she's like, yeah, I would love to help out, love to pitch in, love to do that. So Corey signed up as our president. We incorporated back in April 30th, we were incorporated in Delaware as a nonprofit corporation. And little did I know, several months ago, I'm sure Charlie knows intimately well how much it takes to stand up a nonprofit. I certainly did not know all the steps and all the costs and all the little things here and there that continually popped up. But we have a great attorney helping us out in San Francisco that specializes in this space. So really just been standing up the nonprofit. So it's fortunate when General Martin had to bow out that it was at the time that it did, because it had been really a couple months ago. Like, we literally got the logo like last week. If this had been a couple months ago, probably wouldn't have had as much to talk about in terms of the future here with our association. But what we're really looking to do is, at least starting out, because really we kind of look at it and we're like, there's such a need, there's such a huge gap, there's such a huge problem, there's such a huge need out there. You have to take one bite of the elephant, one bite at a time. And so kind of at first, we're looking to focus on kind of three things. One is rights and education, because many contractors don't know kind of what their rights are. They don't know what few services are available to them. So making sure that we kind of close that gap within the contractor community. The other is creating support networks. Like Vietnam veterans came home and there really wasn't a support network for them. Contractors are doing that today over the past several months. I mean, I've met the widow of a lady whose husband was a truck driver in Iraq 15 plus years ago that killed himself last year. Talking to a guy out in Arizona who was a truck driver in Iraq 20 years ago, and this guy is severe PTSD and is just racked with issues and doesn't know where to turn, how to get help, and there's no one providing that support. So we're looking to kind of fill in and create support networks for contractors, and then also policy advocacy, kind of being a persistent voice, because as I was doing some of the research, like certainly putting this together, it seems like there's bits and pieces out there, like it just kind of pops up and somebody writes an article or does a little bit of research and it just goes by the wayside. There's no one that's out there kind of persistently putting forward the rights and the interest of contractors. And so we want to be that persistent presence, and we want to make sure that contractors aren't invisible as much as probably some would like them to be invisible. We want them to be visible. So we're going to do that. One of the first things that we're focused on, and it's coming soon once our website's up, and that should be up in sometime early to mid-September, is we're going to create a burn pit registry for contractors. If you think about it, the VA, starting in 2014, created a burn pit registry for soldiers. And they screened, I think, like 5.1 million soldiers, veterans, identified 2.1 million exposures. And from all of that came the PACT Act, which allows the VA to presumptively service connect a whole range of illnesses to burn pit exposures. Well, the missing half, like literally at least half of the equation, are the contractors who are there breathing the same air, who are there for, in general, longer than the troops. The troops will come for one deployment, go home, maybe come back a couple times. Some contractors would be there 5-10 years in a row. So they're a completely distinct cohort for epidemiological study that's completely missing. So we plan by the end of September to have our burn pit registry rolled out and start the process of gathering information on contractors and their exposures and their deployments and their illnesses that they've experienced. And then we plan to work with researchers and people that study those things, the epidemiologists, to start capturing that and including that in the research. Kind of after that, that's kind of the first bite of the elephant that we're looking at, kind of following after that. And of course, a lot of this is funding and fundraising, permitting. So as fundraising allows, we'll expand it out. Because I also didn't know how much it costs to start a nonprofit. It's certainly not nothing. But once fundraising allows, we'll look at maybe creating some type of EAP, employee assistance program, right, for contractors, where they can call in and have a counselor, have somebody that can talk to them, and then also is trained to connect them to resources, kind of like Military One Source does for the military and their families. And I didn't know this until recently, but the Wounded Warrior Project was actually an offshoot of Military One Source back in the day. So kind of try and replicate some of that on the contractor side. And fortunately, as we've been standing this up and spreading the word a little bit, connected with Chuck Dunn, who was the EAP manager for Floor in country, and he's the perfect guy to help us with that. He's been involved with Military One Source. He was involved with EAP for Halliburton, then KBR, then DynCorp, and then Floor. So he's come on to our advisory board, and look forward to working with Chuck. He brings invaluable experience to the mental health side of what we're looking to do. And then down the road, we're looking at, maybe next summer, creating some sort of like conference, right, in DC. Start bringing in, I'm sure the first one will be small, but hey, let's start bringing in some of these contractors, getting them together, letting them tell their, small fish stories, and over time and alcohol, see how big they grow. But so that's what we're looking to do. We have our domain, becounted.org. It's not live yet, so if you go there, it's just parked. But we'll have the website up pretty soon.